Good morning. My name is Lew Wilson. I'm an architect with Sullivan, Goulet, and Wilson Architects here in Chicago, and I was glad to help rewrite the Chicago Code and work on the small buildings, small residential chapters. Before we start, I want to just give you a few ground rules for the presentation that I'll give. In general, I will only be addressing building code. I will not address zoning. Different department, different set of rules. We will be looking at a couple of different construction types as they relate to R5 and other residential occupancies, but generally it's because small residential, I'm sure when you were signing up, meant different things to different people. Some might think it's just single family, some might think it's up to a 3-flat, and some larger developers might believe that it's 5 stories and 20 units. So in general, we wanted to make sure that you understand that what we're talking about is R5, 1, 2, or 3 units, 4 or fewer stories. Another thing that you'll notice as we go through, much as Grant showed in his presentation, the building code will be listed as B, the electrical code is listed as E, and it follows that ICC family of code designations. The same thing will become true of occupancy types. Whereas currently residential in the Chicago Code is an A occupancy, it will become an R occupancy. A will become assembly, B business, that sort of thing. So just so you're oriented a little closer. And with that, the primary types of construction that we're looking at for this presentation right now is type 1C, which there's going to be a change in nomenclature. It will become type 2A. It's not a direct, but it's kind of complicated to explain. It's very comparable. So what was the type 1C in current code really becomes 2A. Likewise, what was 3B in the current code, what you're used to thinking of, becomes 3A. And what was the combustible frame type 4A becomes type 5A. The thing that happens is they're going to slip in classification 4, which will be heavy timber, with no A or B. It's a single classification. And as we go on to the further slides, if you're seeing a B or a C in the presentation, you'll know it's related to the current code because I'm really only going to address the A category of the new code, which is slightly more restrictive in terms of hourly ratings, but more generous in terms of benefit. Okay, well, in type 1C, which will become 2A, it's typically used in mid-rise residential. It's a steel frame and stud, concrete and metal deck floors, or perhaps plank, and a non-combustible exterior skin. It's usually used for 4 to 6 stories. It's uneconomical below that, and you have to go to a higher rating to get above it. In this case, it's actually much larger than what an R5 would typically be. But what this would allow you to do is have mixed use, perhaps parking, ground floor retail, or business and that sort of thing, which R5 does not. There is no mixed use in the R5. This is just an example of a typical, type 2A construction. So then we come to the type 3B, which now becomes 3A, what many of you might refer to as bricks and sticks. It's a masonry exterior or protected steel stud, protected with gyp and sheathing and so forth. Also, again, with a non-combustible exterior skin, be it a thick or a thin skin. That'll have implication as to what the interior materials might be, such as requirement for non-combustible insulation on your continuous insulation layer and that sort of thing. However, the interior of the building, walls, floors, roof, are all combustible. Either solid wood, open web wood, joist, anything of that nature. And again, wood-decked floors, which may or may not have topping. So again, this is, your typical, like I say, bricks and sticks, quite suitable for single family, 2 flats and 3 flats. And again, the new code will allow for really the same type of 3 flat construction you typically see, a duplex down, simplex, duplex up, as long as you don't exceed those 3 units or 4 stories. And then finally, combustible frame, 4A becomes 5A. And pretty much it's wood construction, top to bottom. 1 to 3 stories typically. So it's your single family and smaller residential style street fronts. So we get to the residential height limitations. Current code for 1C is 6 stories and 80 feet. We now translate that into the 2A non-sprinklered would be 6 stories and 65 feet, or in the case of the R5, which is because you're limited to the 4 stories, it'll become 4 stories and 65 feet. If we add sprinkler to that, the 2A becomes 6 stories and 85 feet. So you've gained 5 feet off the old height. And again, the R5 really becomes 4 and 85, 4 stories and 85 feet, although I doubt you'd ever get to that. Type 3B, which previously was 4 stories, 55 feet, again, in the non-sprinklered becomes 4 stories and 55, and stays 4 stories and 55 for the R5. When you go to the sprinklered, you now increase to 5 stories and 70 feet. Again, unlike, you would get to that, but your R5 would be 4 stories and 85, which would be highly unlikely. And the type 4A becomes 5A. It was 3 stories, 40 feet, becomes 2 stories and 40 feet, non-sprinklered, stays at the R5, it becomes 3 stories, 40 feet. Type 5A sprinklered becomes 4 stories and 55 feet, same for the R5. Now, again, your current allowable areas, tabular areas within the current code. Type 1C, you take the tabular area for a 2-story, 1 or 2, 2-story. If you go to a 3-story, it's 0.9%, it's 90% of that. And if you go to a 4th story, it's 85%. So a type 1C becomes 20,000 square foot, 3-story becomes 18, 4-story becomes 17,000. Same concept for the 3B. You start at the 8,000 and work your way down. In the 4A, you're really capped at the 2 stories. So you can have the 3rd story of 800 square foot, which is not a full story. In the same scenario, but if you add sprinklering, you essentially double each of those areas until you get down to the type 4A, which will become or stay 4,000 with an 800 square foot 3rd floor. When you go to the new code, type 2A has a tabular area of 72,000 square foot per building. And I want to just go back. In the current code, these numbers are per floor, which are then multiplied by your allowable number of floors and then ultimately capped by FAR or maximum area. In the new code, the area starts out as tabular square foot per building. The modifiers for that, and we'll get to the formula in just a moment, for a non-sprinklered building with the assumption of complete frontage, I've made no reductions for frontage on this, would double your tabular area. So your allowable in a non-sprinklered 2A would become 144,000 square feet, divided by your maximum number of floors, or your ultimate number of floors. Type 3A works same, and 5A obviously the same. If you sprinkler the building, you get another 100% increase on your initial tabular area, meaning that your 72,000 now is multiplied by 3, brings you up to 216,000 per building. Likewise, type 3A, 90,000, type 5A, 45. Okay, the way that formula works is your allowable area increase is your base area, tabular, times your frontage over perimeter. Your frontage in the new code is between 20 and 30 feet. You get a bonus for that, where currently you only get a bonus if it's 30 feet or wider. And if you have 30 feet, you get a higher percentage of bonus. But in this case, what I've taken is 100% frontage with 30 or more foot of open area. So making it simple to give you a frontage of 100. And then your non-sprinklered factor, the NS equals 1, is given to you per code. It's in the chart. In a sprinklered building, it's 2. In a non-sprinklered, it's 1. So at the end of the day, you get 1 times 1 times 1 plus 1, meaning you get a 2. In your sprinklered building, you're getting a 1 times 2, meaning you get 2 added on to your base. So your increase is substantially larger. Again, just as a note, sprinklering will be required in all but the R5 occupancies, and with some very minor exceptions. So it's 1, 2, or 3 units, 4 stories or less. The overall frontage increases will be reduced from 150% currently to 100%, or that factor of 1, as I discussed. But again, it is somewhat offset by the fact that you do get a small percentage for that kind of gray area between 20 and 30 foot of free space. The other drop down will be open but covered areas, porches and so forth, decks, will count as area. So even if the sides are open but it is roofed or covered, it will count as area. Again, the feeling is that there's enough area built into the original tabular areas with modifiers that it really should not affect the overall end result. So if we look at fire ratings of exterior bearing walls, on a 1C currently, that's a 2-hour rating. What happens is that the modifier is for the 2A or the new code, from 0 to less than 3 feet will be a 2-hour requirement. From 3 foot to less than 30 becomes a 1 hour, and above 30 feet, there's no requirement for rating. Likewise, 3B, which currently is a 3-hour rating, drops to a 2 at that 0 to just less than 3. 3 to 30 becomes 1, and above 30, 0. The 1A, 1 hour, becomes increased in the 0 to less than 3 foot, but at 3 foot drops to an hour. In Grant's original presentation, he mentioned the townhome separations. What will happen now is townhomes will be rated to the exterior wall the same as the last slide, which brings you to a 2-hour enclosure depending on your distance to a lot line. And you will be allowed to have 3 townhomes in a row. After 3, 4th to 6th, you will have to have a 4-hour firewall between each group of units. So what would happen is you'd have a 2-hour enclosing wall, 1 hour separating the 2 interior units, and then a 4-hour firewall to then take you to the next series of townhomes. Be it, let's say it was 3, again, it would be a 1 hour, 1 hour, 2-hour enclosing wall. And that continues on for as far as your townhome takes you. Fire ratings for exterior non-bearing walls. Again, Chicago code has it pretty much, or current code has it as a 211. The new code will be up to 3 feet, will be 2. 3 foot to just up to 30 will be 1, and then 0, similar to the bearing wall enclosures. And it really is all based on distance to lot line. The other thing that we'll discuss in a few moments is the openings in those walls for windows and so forth. You will now be, for non-protected openings, you'll be limited to the percentage of wall opening. Good news is type 3 construction currently requires a parapet above the roof. In the 2020 code, no parapet will be required as long as you have a Class C or better roof covering and you protect the deck for 4 feet around the perimeter of the building. And that can be either a non-combustible or a protected deck. The current code allows a single exit from the 3rd floor if it's under 800 square feet or if the building is sprinklered, fully sprinklered. The single exit rules really will be very, very similar for the new code, so not much change there. And again, the current code requires a 42-inch high guardrail. That will be reduced to a 36-inch in the R5. Live loading for privately accessed porches and decks will be reduced from the current 100-pound live load to 60-pound. That is specifically for privately accessed decks and porches. Your back porch, exiting from the third floor or whatever, it will be maintained at 100-pound live load because it's accessed by more than one unit. This is the same comment on the seismic and wind loading that Grant went through. R5 will now have opening size requirements for windows and glazing, limiting the percentage of openings based on distance to the property line. And what that graphically means is at 0 feet you get 0 openings. At 2 feet you get 10% of protected openings, or the building must be sprinklered. At 3 feet you are now allowed up to 25%, and at 5 foot you then reach the no limit on glazing. On the non-sprinklered and unprotected building openings, again, 0 foot is 0. At 2 foot, you are allowed 5% of those of the wall in unprotected opening. At 3 foot, you are allowed 25%, and by 5 foot, you are allowed that same no limit. Currently, exterior stairs are allowed to be 30 foot in height with the addition of another 15 feet for the 2020 Chicago Building Code. I'll now turn it over to Carl.